Deep in the Zambezi Valley, where the modern world hasn't quite reached, there walks a people who shouldn't exist. Their feet don't look human. 2 toes instead of 5, split down the middle like the foot of an ostrich, like nature tried to create something else and stopped halfway. The Vadoma tribe, the Ostrich People. For generations, anthropologists whispered about them in academic circles, published carefully worded papers that danced around the truth, showed photographs that made you look twice to make sure you were seeing what you thought you were seeing. But nobody wanted to ask the real question. What happens when a group of people isolates themselves so completely that their gene pool becomes a closed loop? What happens when the same DNA circles back on itself for centuries, creating mutations that would normally disappear, but instead become permanent, defining, inescapable? Tonight, we're walking into that forbidden territory, into a story about genetic isolation so extreme it rewrote human anatomy. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Vadoma tribe lives in the remote northern regions of Zimbabwe, in valleys so isolated that even the colonial powers barely touched them. They call themselves the Vadoma or Dama people, and they've lived in these mountains for as long as anyone can remember, possibly thousands of years. But it's their feet that define them, that mark them as different from every other human population on Earth. Ectrodactyly, that's the medical term, a congenital disorder where the central digits of the foot are absent, leaving only 2 toes, 1 on each side, creating a cleft down the middle that makes the foot look like it belongs to a bird rather than a person. In most populations, this mutation is incredibly rare, occurring in about 1 in 90,000 births, but in the Vadoma tribe, it appears in 1 out of every 4 people, 1 in 4. Let that number sink in. This isn't a random genetic accident. This is a population where a severe mutation has become normal, where the exception has become the rule, where isolation has turned human evolution into something we weren't meant to witness. The Vadoma didn't choose this mutation. It chose them. Somewhere in their ancestral past, perhaps 500 years ago, perhaps 1,000, a child was born with ectrodactyly in this isolated community. In any other population, that genetic trait would have disappeared, diluted by marriages outside the group, absorbed back into the broader gene pool until it vanished. But the Vadoma were different. They were isolated, geographically and culturally, living in valleys that required days of difficult travel to reach, surrounded by other tribes who viewed them with suspicion. And more importantly, they had rules. Strict marriage rules that made it forbidden to marry outside the tribe. The Vadoma only married other Vadoma. Generation after generation, the same families intermarrying, the same bloodlines folding back on themselves, and that one mutation, that 2-toed foot, began to spread. This is called the founder effect in genetics, and it's one of the most powerful forces in human evolution. When a small population becomes isolated and begins breeding only within itself, rare genetic traits can become common simply through mathematical probability. Every child born in the Vadoma tribe had a chance of inheriting the ectrodactyly gene because it was present in so many of their ancestors. The gene pool wasn't just small, it was stagnant, a closed system where the same genetic material recycled endlessly. And unlike harmful mutations that kill before reproduction, ectrodactyly doesn't prevent survival. It's uncomfortable, it's stigmatizing in the outside world, but it doesn't stop you from living, from having children, from passing that gene forward. The Vadoma call it the mark of the ancestors, and in their culture, it's not viewed as a deformity, it's viewed as proof of pure bloodline, evidence that you're truly Vadoma and not diluted by outside influence. Children born with 2 toes are considered blessed, marked by the spirits, carriers of the tribal identity in their very bones. But this cultural acceptance did something terrifying from a genetic perspective. It removed the selective pressure that would normally eliminate such a trait. In most societies, people with visible physical differences face discrimination that can affect marriage prospects and reproduction rates. Not among the Vadoma. Here, the mutation was celebrated, protected, perpetuated deliberately through cultural practice and geographic isolation. Scientists who studied the Vadoma in the late 20th century were shocked by what they found. The ectrodactyly gene wasn't just present, it was dominant in multiple family lines, suggesting that it had been reinforced over centuries through consanguineous marriages, through unions between relatives who both carried the recessive gene. The tribe's population has never been large, probably never more than few thousand people spread across several villages. And within that small number, everyone is related. Third cousins marrying third cousins. Second cousins marrying second cousins, sometimes closer. The genetic distance between any two Vadoma individuals is frighteningly small, and the ectrodactyly gene is just the most visible result of that genetic bottleneck. It's what we can see, but what other mutations are hiding in that closed gene pool, invisible but present, waiting to express themselves? They walk differently. You notice it immediately if you ever see the Vadoma in person. The gait isn't quite human. It's more careful, more deliberate, with weight distributed differently across feet that weren't designed for the terrain they navigate daily. The two toes, thick and calloused, grip the earth like claws. Some say they're actually better climbers because of it, that the split foot provides better grip on rocks and tree branches. The Vadoma themselves claim their ancestors could outrun anyone in the mountains, that the ostrich foot made them faster, more agile in their natural environment. But the medical reality tells a different story. Ectrodactyly causes chronic pain in many cases. The weight-bearing bones of the foot are missing or malformed, forcing the remaining structures to compensate. Walking long distances becomes excruciating. The arch of the foot collapses differently. Ankles twist more easily, and there's no hiding it, no pretending you're normal when you step outside Vadoma territory. For centuries, this didn't matter. The Vadoma stayed in their valleys, lived their lives, and the outside world barely knew they existed. But colonialism changed everything. When the British and then the Rhodesian government began asserting control over the region in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they encountered the Vadoma and reacted with horror and fascination in equal measure. Medical officers documented the ostrich-footed natives in reports that read like cryptozoology. Missionaries tried to explain the mutation as divine punishment or demonic influence. Anthropologists arrived with cameras and calipers, measuring skulls and feet, taking photographs that would end up in medical journals and freak show exhibitions in Europe and America. The Vadoma became specimens, curiosities, proof that human evolution could go wrong in spectacular ways. But here's what nobody wanted to acknowledge. The Vadoma weren't suffering from some ancient curse or isolated incident. They were suffering from something we created, from the colonial boundaries that made their isolation absolute, from the economic systems that made them too poor to leave, from the cultural stigma that made outsiders unwilling to marry into the tribe even if they wanted to. The genetic isolation that created the ostrich foot wasn't natural. It was enforced first by geography, then by human systems of control and separation. When Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980, things didn't immediately improve. The Vadoma remained isolated, economically marginalized, living in regions without roads or schools or medical facilities. Their gene pool remained closed not because they chose it, but because they had no other option. And then came the photographs. In the age of the internet, images of Vadoma feet spread across the world, shared in medical forums and shock websites and social media. The tribe that had lived in obscurity for centuries suddenly became famous for all the wrong reasons. People called them freaks, mutants, proof of inbreeding and genetic degradation. Others romanticized them, called them mystical, blessed by ancient spirits, keepers of secret wisdom. Both responses missed the point. The Vadoma aren't mystical or monstrous. They're human beings trapped in a genetic bottleneck, carrying in their feet the evidence of what happens when isolation becomes absolute, when a gene pool closes and evolution stops moving forward and starts circling back on itself. Their feet are a warning written in bone and flesh. Section 4. The children who carry the curse every birth in a Vadoma village carries the same terrible uncertainty. Will this child have 5 toes or 2? Will they walk normally or carry the mark that defines the tribe? Mothers count the toes while the infant is still wet with birth, and in that moment something shifts. If the child has 10 toes, 5 on each foot, there's relief mixed with something darker. Relief because the child won't face the physical challenges of ectrodactyly, won't struggle with pain and limited mobility, but also a quiet sense of loss, because that child isn't fully Vadoma anymore, not in the way the tribe defines itself. They're unmarked, unblessed by the ancestors, and some families view this with suspicion. Did the mother stray? Is their outside blood contaminating the line? But if the child has 2 toes on each foot, if that distinctive split is visible, then there's celebration. The ancestors have blessed this child. The pure bloodline continues. The baby is wrapped carefully, shown to the elders, given names that honor the tradition. Nobody talks about the pain that child will face as they grow, as their weight increases, and those 2 toes struggle to support a body that's getting heavier every year. Nobody mentions that this child will never be able to leave the valley without facing stares and questions and medical examinations. Nobody acknowledges that they've just sentenced this infant to a life defined by a genetic mutation that 99.9% of humanity doesn't carry. The children grow up knowing they're different, but in the village, different is normal. Everyone walks the same way, struggles with the same challenges, wears the same modified shoes, or goes barefoot when the pain gets too intense. But childhood in an isolated tribe isn't peaceful. It's brutal in ways outsiders don't understand. Resources are limited. Medical care is non-existent. A simple infection that would be treated with antibiotics anywhere else can become life-threatening. And the ectrodactyly makes things worse. The malformed feet are prone to injuries, to pressure sores that don't heal properly, to fungal infections in the deep cleft between the 2 toes. Children die from complications that wouldn't kill a child with normal feet, and the tribe buries them in the hills and says the ancestors called them home. By the time these children reach adolescence, they understand the truth their parents won't speak aloud. They're trapped. Leaving the tribe means facing a world that will see them as freaks, as medical anomalies, as objects of pity or horror. Staying means marrying within the tribe, continuing the cycle, giving birth to children who will inherit the same split feet, the same genetic burden. There's no good choice. Some young Vadoma have tried to leave, have walked for days to reach towns where they hope to find work, to build different lives. Almost all of them came back. The discrimination was too intense. Employers wouldn't hire them. Potential partners recoiled. Children pointed and laughed. The outside world had no place for ostrich-footed people, and so they returned to the only place where their feet didn't define them as monsters. They returned to the genetic prison that created them. They say you can't see a curse until it starts repeating. Generation after generation, the same faces, the same features, the same feet. It's as if time itself stopped moving in the Vadoma Valley, like the rest of the world moved forward while this place kept looping through the same ancient DNA. But there's something even darker beneath that surface, something the scientists who studied them never wrote in their reports. Because when you study a population like the Vadoma, you start noticing more than just toes. You notice patterns, small cognitive differences, subtle delays in speech development, slight irregularities in skull formation, in vision, in hearing. Things that don't make it into the photographs. The kind of mutations that hide in the background, accumulating quietly until one day, they're impossible to ignore. By the late 1990s, geneticists visiting the region began finding something horrifying. The Vadoma gene pool was collapsing. Decades of intermarriage had not only cemented ectrodactyly as a defining feature, but had also increased the risk of other recessive disorders, heart malformations, skeletal deformities, developmental issues. These were the invisible costs of purity, the genetic ghosts of isolation. And yet, when the researchers tried to explain this, when they tried to convince the tribe to mix with neighboring groups to save future generations, the Vadoma elders refused. "Our blood is sacred," they said. "The spirits chose our form. To change it would be to betray them." There's a chilling beauty in that kind of belief, the idea that suffering can become sacred if it's old enough, if it's been passed down long enough to feel like identity. It's what keeps the cycle alive, even when everyone knows it's destroying them. And here's where the story turns inward, because this isn't just about one tribe in Zimbabwe. The Vadoma are a mirror, reflecting something that lives in all of us, the human need to belong so badly that we'd rather repeat our own pain than risk being alone. Their mutation isn't just genetic, it's generational trauma carved into flesh. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you break the cycle or protect it? Some say the Vadoma are a warning. Others say they're a prophecy, a glimpse of what humanity could become if we ever stop moving, if we ever stop mixing. But there's another theory, whispered by a few anthropologists who spent years living among them. They believed the Vadoma weren't just isolated by geography, but by choice, that centuries ago their ancestors fled something, a war, a disease, a punishment, something that drove them deep into the Zambezi Valley, where they sealed themselves off to survive. And when the danger passed, they never came back out. They built walls around themselves that time could never tear down. The price of survival became mutation. The cost of safety was transformation. There are stories still told in the villages about a time before the two toes, when their ancestors walked like other men. They speak of a spirit that came in a dream, a tall, bird-like being that told them to walk differently, so the world would never find them again. And in some strange, poetic way, they obeyed. Whether it was myth or memory, no one knows. But when you listen to them talk about their ancestors, you start to realize something. The mutation that science calls ectrodactyly, they call destiny. They see it not as an error, but as evolution with intent. And that belief is powerful enough to keep an entire people bound to it, generation after generation. But imagine being born into that destiny, with the world outside calling you cursed, diseased, inbred. Imagine growing up believing you carry proof that your ancestors were chosen while knowing that the rest of humanity sees you as broken. That contradiction would tear most people apart. But for the Vadoma, it's become a kind of strength, a way to turn pain into pride. Maybe that's how all human stories survive, by transforming suffering into something sacred. Somewhere between biology and belief, between evolution and faith, the Vadoma became something the modern world can't quite define. Neither monster nor miracle, not victims, not myths. Just the last survivors of a decision made so long ago that even they no longer remember why, but their feet still remember. Every step they take is a repetition of that ancient choice to stay hidden, no matter the cost. If you ever travel through northern Zimbabwe, through the rugged ridges and dust-choked valleys where the Zambezi cuts the earth like an old scar, you might catch a glimpse of them. Barefoot figures walking along the hills, balancing baskets, their steps strangely graceful, almost alien. You'll know them by the way they move, the way their feet spread against the dirt like they were born of the earth itself. The Vadoma don't hide anymore, but they don't invite curiosity either. They exist quietly, outside of time, surviving on their own terms while the world photographs and speculates and stares. Today, scientists continue to visit the region, trying to map the genetic sequence of ectrodactyly, hoping to understand what centuries of isolation can do to the human genome. But every time they take a blood sample, every time they write a report, they're reminded that the Vadoma are not experiments, they are people. Living, breathing proof that evolution is not a straight line forward, but a loop that sometimes circles back on itself. The tribe has endured famine, persecution, forced relocation, and ridicule, yet they remain. Their mutation, once whispered about like a curse, is now their emblem of endurance. What the world calls deformity, they call identity. What the world sees as abnormal, they see as survival. And maybe that's the real horror here, not the feat, not the mutation, but the mirror it holds up to the rest of us. Because the Vadoma remind us how fragile the human story really is. Strip away the cities, the technology, the noise, and we are still creatures bound by our genes, by our fears, by our desperate need to belong somewhere, even if that belonging costs us everything. We look at their toed feet and recoil, but the truth is, we all carry our own deformities. Ours just hide deeper, in the mind, in the spirit, in the things we inherit from the generations before us. When the camera turns off, when the researchers leave, the Vadoma return to their mountains. Fires glow against the dark, children laugh, the same stars shine that once guided their ancestors into hiding. Life continues. 2 toes press into the dust, tracing the same patterns their bloodline has walked for 1,000 years. And in that dust, in that silence, lies a truth older than language, that isolation changes everything, even us.